All right. Hi everyone. Welcome back. I feel like I get uglier every time I do this. I should try a little harder. At least throw on some mascara. But anyways, sorry about that. Sorry about the appearance. Um I'll do better next time. But anyways, I am still working on grading papers. Some of you have gotten them back. If you have any questions, just let me know. Email me, and I will try to answer. Yeah, so working on them in the process, and yeah. So today we're continuing our discussion of free will, and last lecture I forgot the name of this guy, but his name is John Earman. So he kind of gives us the deterministic approach to free will, and he is still alive. He was born in 1942. He's not a professor right now, but he was a professor at the University of Pittsburgh in the history and philosophy department. Yeah, free will is like his big thing. Well, I guess the opposite of free will, determinism. And so the passage that I got for you guys is actually from like a really big book that he wrote on. It's called A Primer on Determinism, and it kind of goes through a bunch of different theories and stuff like that. So we just kind of chose the most relevant to us chapter to read. And it kind of sums up a lot of what he was saying in the book, what he had already said, and also gives like his conclusion, basic thoughts, stuff like that. So that's why I went with this chapter. I also felt like he did a good job of explaining the other side, so I think it's good to hear that. And to hear that he acknowledges that he has no new answers. That's something that I always appreciate in philosophical writing, because most people don't have new things to say, just maybe a new iteration or maybe a new way to say the same thing. So anyways, I just appreciate that. And he acknowledges that it almost seems like a dead-end problem, like the fight between determinism and free will, because both sides kind of have made up their mind and are happy with where they're at and aren't going to change their minds because someone wrote a compelling article or something like that. So he acknowledges all that. He knows that he probably won't convince people, but he lays it out, as good as he can. So this chapter, he's kind of lays out his thesis. He says, I do hope to be able to illuminate the role determinism plays in generating the controversies, and secondarily, I hope to show why thinking about these controversies is like banging your head against the wall. Very honest and very true. It's like, even the more you think about it, the more frustrating it gets, because determinism will probably always have the same problems of, it seems that we're free, and how do you hold people responsible for their actions if they're not? And then free will always have its problems of science. There are laws of nature, so it seems that the laws of nature would cause things to happen in a way that we can't help. So, I mean, both seem like they have compelling objections. So first, Earman starts with the compatibilist position, which would just be the middle ground between libertarianism and determinism. And I know libertarianism is a word that's used in politics, but it's not the same way that we're using the word. In this case, it just means you believe in free will. So He also references a bunch of other philosophers, but no need to remember them. I mean, you can. It's good to remember them, but no need to know who everyone is. He just brings them up because they represent a certain position. So if that was confusing, I'm sorry. But hopefully you were able to kind of weave around that and figure out what he was saying. Okay, so he talks about responsibility in regards to the compatibilist position, and he has a few points, agreements that seem to be common sense that everybody seems to agree with. So, whoops. So the first one, so C1 being condition 1, is that people, I'm just going to abbreviate, should be held responsible for their actions unless there are exculpating circumstances. I'll just say unless exculpating. Oh, and I just looked up this word so that I could say, hey, this is what this word means. Hold on. Don't mind me just Googling. Okay. Yeah, it means to show or declare that someone is not guilty of wrongdoing. So people should be held responsible for their actions unless it is shown that they're not guilty of wrongdoing. That makes sense. And then C2 is that circumstances which make it possible. Impossible, sorry. Which make it impossible for a person to act freely are exculpating. So if there's a situation where it's impossible for you to act freely, then you're shown to not be guilty of wrongdoing because you couldn't help it. Okay, and then we'll just go all the way over here for C3. Discoveries. In physics and the life sciences, indicating that determinism applies to people as well as in inanimate particles. Would not undermine ascriptions of responsibility. Okay, so discoveries in physics and life sciences, indicating that determinism applies to people as well as inanimate particles, would not undermine ascriptions of responsibility. So, if determinism applies to people, it also applies to inanimate objects, like the way that a sunflower points towards the sun is according to natural laws and not its choice or decision making. So, even though that's the case, it wouldn't undermine human responsibility. So even if, which is kind of, I mean, that's controversial, that if everything we do is determined just as inanimate objects are determined, that we still are responsible for our actions. But that is one of his main points. All right. Then we get another. I'm going to go ahead and erase these so that I have room. I can't get a good enough angle to get the whiteboard fully in the picture, so sorry about that. So then we have a definition of freedom, which is that freedom is the absence of compulsion, coercion, constraint. So that's kind of a pretty basic definition of freedom that most would agree with, that if you are free, then that means that you're not under compulsion, coercion, or constraint. So then he discusses this Schlick character, talking about when man is responsible for his actions. And Schlick states that freedom is the absence of these factors, and Ehrman would say that these freedom, as this definition, is actually compatible with determinism, since natural laws do not entail them. Laws of nature do not prescribe what happens, but only describe it. So, natural laws prescribe. Oh wait, sorry. Describe rather than prescribe. So the difference between describing and prescribing would be that natural laws don't write into existence what is going to happen, but just describe what is happening. So in that case, natural laws don't make it to where you're under compulsion, coercion, or constraint. Right. Then Ehrman states that natural laws do not compel or prescribe in the cases where it is physically impossible for the agent to raise his arm because of the strength of the gravitational field or the strength of the straps that bind his wrists, but the impossibility is no less for that. So he gives the example of a man lifting his arm, and his arm can go up in a convulsive twitch or jerk, but he himself cannot raise his arm. He can't choose to raise his arm. So, no such warping of the agent's natural desires, but the unfolding of his normal genetic heritage. So, there's no warping of his natural desires, just his genetic heritage. So then Schlick, the compatibilist, would presumably say that the agent is free to raise his arm. But he's not exactly free to raise his arm. Then he talks about libertarians, which once again, libertarians would just be not determinists. So then, at the end of this little section on compatibilism, he says, what is threatened is nothing less than the basis of the moral perspective in our sense of worth as human beings. So, if determinism is true, then what is threatened is the basis of our moral perspective and our sense of worth as human beings. Because if everything we do has just been planned and we can't change anything, we can't make any of our own decisions, then it kind of, I mean, maybe you don't think so, but I think intuitively most people would think, okay, so what's the purpose, what's the point, what's the worth of being a human then, if everything's just written already? Which this kind of reminded me, I don't know if this is a relevant example, but I don't know how many of you watch The Bachelorette, but it's a pretty crazy season right now, and it just started. We're only on episode 3, and this probably isn't relevant at all, but I'm going to try and tie it in. So if you are watching, if you're not watching, then disregard everything I'm saying right now. Just take a break. But if you are watching, then you know that Claire Crawley is obsessed with Dale, and that she goes on these dates with other guys. It means absolutely nothing to her. All she wants is to see Dale. And so the guys in the most recent episode are basically like, what's the point of me being here, because you've already decided what's happening, and like there seems to be no point to like play this game when everything is already decided. That's kind of relevant, right? Like, if everything in your life is already decided, then it's like, why am I here? Why am I playing this game? I think that works as an analogy. Also, this season is infuriating if you're watching. I don't think okay, sorry. I shouldn't go on this tangent, but I don't think I could dislike a lead as much as I disliked Peter. But here we are. Claire Crawley. I don't know if she's worse than Peter, but she's definitely at least equally bad. Okay, anyways, off of that. Moving on. Okay. Then, in the next little section, you have the question of how are the actions of man different from those of a sunflower as it turns to face the sun? If determinism is true, aren't all of our actions merely complicated cases of tropisms, forced motions produced by circumstances beyond our control? So, the fact that I'm raising my arm right now would be no different than my plants over there. Oh, if you can see, facing towards the sun, because that's just what the laws of nature dictate them to do, and the laws of nature would just be dictating me to raise my arm at any given moment. So, he says that the immediate and obvious difficulty is that human actions are mediated by mental states and mental acts, so that any serious answers to the question must come to grips with the mind-body problem, which is a problem second only to the determinism free will problem in its divisiveness and intractability. So we've already discussed the mind-body problem of is our mind separate from our body, or is it all one and the same? Free will and determinism is like that, in that it is so, like there isn't, you kind of come to a crossroads where Neither side is going to be convinced of the other side. And he brings up that it seems that you might have to determine the mind-body problem just in order to answer the determinism free will problem. If your mind and body are separate, and your mind is capable of making choices outside of the material body, then maybe we have free will. If the mind and body are the same, and just the material body that's controlled by external forces, then you wouldn't have free will. So it would be determinism. So he says we have two cases to consider. Either the mental is parasitic on the physical, or it's not. And parasitism is just, he states that for any physically possible worlds, World 1 and World 2, if World 1 and World 2 agree on all physical attributes, then they agree on all mental attributes as well. So, mental and physical attributes would be one and the same pretty much. They would go hand in hand. And this could help us determine the mind-body problem and the determinism free will problem. Okay. Then he kind of moves on to state that the commonly cited motivation is to show, by tracing back the state to a time before the agent was born, that the agent's actions are produced by factors that are clearly not under his control. So, people want to state that by going back before the agent was born, there were all these things in the world going on that affected who this person was going to become. And none of that was under his or her control. So that would be an argument for determinism, because you had no choice in the matter where you would be born, how you would be born, and all those factors play a huge role in who you become as a person. So some people believe in kind of a social determinism, where you're born, where you grow up, who you're around, those types of things determine who you're going to be, rather than you choosing, I'm going to be like this. Like maybe, like if you look at your past. So if I look at my past, if I'm like, why did I become a philosophy grad student? Well, I chose philosophy because I felt like I grew up in a place where people didn't really think much about what they believed or what they thought. So in that way, my social climate and social environment determined who I would become in some way. That's just a small example. It's not without its flaws either, but yeah, you can think of any example really for people being the way they are based on their environment. Anyways, then we get kind of a more of a definition of what a libertarian is. It says libertarians are so called because they want to go on to join to this construction of further premises. If human actions are deterministically explained by exactly the same factors that explain the actions of sunflowers, then humans no more act freely than do sunflowers. So libertarians would state that if my actions are already determined in the same way that a sunflower's actions are determined, then in the same way that the sunflower is not making conscious decisions, I would not be making conscious decisions. So, I think that's intuitively compelling on some level, because we as humans think ourselves to be different. I mean, we're having this conversation. This is not a conversation that sunflowers would have, probably. Most likely. You never know, but... So it seems like we're distinctly different. So if we're determined in the exact same way that inanimate objects are determined, then what accounts for what seems to be so different? It's an important question. Right. Okay, so then, still talking about the sunflowers, the actions of men are also explained by later states involving beliefs, preferences, motives, intentions, etc., and this constitutes a significant difference from sunflowers. So, instead of saying that humans and sunflowers are the same because they're both determined, you could say that they are both determined, but humans are still significantly different and distinct because humans have mental states such as beliefs, preferences, motivations, intentions that sunflowers won't have. So the fact that sunflowers are determined in the same way that we are doesn't mean that we're the same mentally. Just because we're the same physically doesn't mean we're the same mentally. Then we kind of get into the science of human behavior. So B.F. Skinner was a psychologist, and he argued that turning away from determinism is tantamount to abandoning the possibility of a science of human behavior. So if we disregard determinism, then we kind of lose the ability to have a science of human behavior, because determinism allows us to see laws in nature and laws in human nature. So, in order to have an understanding of the laws of human nature, then you would arguably need determinism on some level. So then Ehrman puts together three boundary conditions on a resolution of the determinism free will problem. So you have three conditions. You have one that we get from Skinner, which is that the resolution makes a science of human behavior possible. Then we get the resolution implies that the agent determines his behavior. All right, and then 3, we get that the resolution allows the agent to be autonomous in that his behavior is not a form of tropism. So we want a resolution that will account for all of these conditions. But there seems to be an impossibility in reconciling all three of these. Indeterminism will not by itself secure the required autonomy. And determinism will answer one, but doesn't really seem to answer the rest. Now, near the end of this paper, Ehrman gets more, like, he shows his cards a little bit more, like what he believes to be true. He says, agent determinism pushes us toward the worst form of indeterminism, the absence of natural laws, deterministic or indeterministic, for human behavior. So, you don't want something that's going to allow for the absence of natural laws, because we want to understand human behavior, and for that you need natural laws. So you can't have agent determinism or indeterminism. Agent determinism being a specific form of indeterminism in which the agent determines. The agent being, I'm realizing that not all of the terms are super clear, but an agent would just be like the person. Okay, so I'm just going to jump to the conclusion because it's easy to get caught up in each little thing, but I think it's best if we understand it big picture. So, for Ehrman, he says, my characterization of physical determinism employs a conception of the physical that is so broad that it seems to swallow up the mental. So, he is a determinist. Determinism leaves an indelible mark on every subject it brushes against, is his claim. So he's a physical determinist, meaning that natural laws determine what's going to happen. But he clarifies in his last little paragraph that as a practical solution, I recommend the ostrich tactic. Don't think too closely or too long on the issues raised here, and in daily life continue with the presumption that the I that chooses and the self to which we attach value judgments are autonomous. So why would he write a whole book on determinism just to say, live like an indeterminist? Live as though you make your own choices. There seems to be some disconnect there. But it could be the same, like if you're a skeptic, on some level you will always live as a non-skeptic, because anytime you turn on a light, you're assuming that the wiring is right and that the light will turn on. Anytime you sit in a chair, you're assuming that the chair isn't broken and isn't going to just fall out. So in everything you do, you're actually having a belief about something, even though skepticism would mean that you don't form beliefs on stuff, or you refrain from deciding to believe things. So in the same way, for the determinist, Ehrman thinks that even if determinism is true, which he thinks it is, if you live like a determinist, then you'll basically be living as though there's no responsibility for your actions. So, whether determinism is true or whether indeterminism is true, either way, you should still live life as though you hadn't figured it out yet, as though you don't know yet. Which sounds kind of contrary to critical thinking, maybe, like you spend all this time trying to figure out an answer to something, but it actually doesn't change the way that you live at all. But it does give you a deeper understanding of the world. So even if it doesn't change the way that you act, it still changes your understanding of how things work. It helps you understand things. Yeah, so even if you don't see like the practical benefit of believing in determinism versus indeterminism, there's still value there. It's just not practical typically. And that's one of the things I appreciated about this paper, was that he acknowledges that that's the case in a lot of philosophy. Like, whether you believe that the mind and body are separate or aren't separate, you're probably going to live in the same way that you would, whether you knew it or not. So it's good to think, it's good to consider, think through things, but sometimes it doesn't have a huge bearing on the way that you act, the way that you are. So anyways, I'm going to kind of cut it short today, just because I want you to get the main gist of the paper, and if I keep talking, then it might get more confusing. So, yeah, if you have any questions, please send them my way. I hope everyone's doing well. We're nearing Thanksgiving, kind of, so that's amazing and exciting. So anyways, I'll talk to you guys next week. I hope that you have a great weekend.